Human-machine interfaces come in many different guises nowadays, and fundamentally, not much has changed in the past few hundred years. We use the binary principle of starting and stopping to modulate the actions of our devices, except now this happens thousands or millions of times per second. This concept, a binary framework, is apparent not only in our machines, but also in our physiology. Depolarization and hyperpolarization is used by our nervous system to send signals around our bodies. And like our synthetic machines, our bodies send many discrete, small signals very close to one another as a way of producing what on a large scale looks like an analog signal. To understand how machines can interface directly with our physiology, let's get a closer understanding of the neurobiology concerning voluntary muscle contractions. So if we look at the muscle along its length, zoomed in all the way, we see that the muscle is composed of bundles of protein strands called actin and myosin. They only contract when calcium ions are released into the space around these filaments. So how are the calcium ions released? Now we get to the part of the process that starts to look more like the binary operations we were talking about before. Calcium ions are released from their storage when an action potential, a wave of depolarization, moves down the sarcolemma. When this wave reaches a voltage-sensitive gate, it is opened and releases the calcium ions. So how did this action potential in the sarcolemma begin? Well, it arrived here in the sarcolemma because it was propagated from a neuromuscular junction where one axon terminal of a motor neuron meets the motor unit it's innervating. Before crossing the synaptic cleft, the action potential propagated down the motor neuron to the axon terminal, where it caused voltage-sensitive gates to open, allowing calcium ions to flow in, causing the release of the chemical neurotransmitter acetylcholine. This acetylcholine diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to receptors on the sarcolemma of the motor unit. These in turn open channels for sodium and potassium ions to move through. The net effect of this is to change the local membrane potential, which then spreads to adjacent areas, opening more voltage-gated sodium channels, and if enough of these voltage-sensitive gates are opened, the threshold is reached and an action potential is initiated and propagated down the sarcolemma. Now we understand how the nervous system uses electricity to transmit signals. We can see the resemblance between it and synthetic machines. They speak the same language, voltage. To voluntarily move our arm, our intention to move initiates a cascading flow of changes in voltage from our brain to our arm. Neurons in our primary motor cortex are excited. This excitation is propagated to the upper motor neurons of the corticospinal tract, which carry the information down the lateral pathways of the spinal cord to the lower motor neurons, which themselves transmit the excitation to the motor unit. Once contracted, mechanoreceptors detect and transmit this information via another series of electrical signals up to the somatosensory cortex of the brain via primary afferent axons and the dorsal pathways of the spinal column, thereby closing the feedback loop. We can, given the right technology, detect and input signals along these pathways and use them as inputs to our devices. This is the physiological basis of neurological prosthetic devices. So each disability is unique, so the devices must be designed to interface with a part of the patient's physiology which will best enable them and the system to work together. So let's categorize these devices by the location where the subject and device interface: the brain, spine, or the periphery. Devices which interface with the periphery can directly sense and stimulate the peripheral nervous system nerves or muscles directly. This latter method is often used after an amputation, which leaves some muscles above the amputation site relatively undisturbed. These residual muscles can have sensors placed on or within them, and the user can then control their prosthesis by contracting and relaxing these muscles. Though retraining the motor activation patterns is a very difficult task for the patient, a 17-year follow-up study of 2 paraplegic patients with thoracic spinal injuries were eventually able to use this type of prosthetic to perform exercise, climb stairs, and stand for 18 to 20 minutes at a time. Devices which directly interface with the nerves of the PNS come in a few shapes and sizes, named for the way the synthetic material attaches to the nerves of the PNS. Helical, book, and cuff electrodes all enclose a nerve in some way and act in a similar manner to the neuromuscular junction. They detect that an action potential has arrived and use this as an input to the device. Not only are these devices able to sense efferent signals, they are also now capable of sending signals back to the brain via the afferent pathway, closing the control loop and greatly increasing the degree of control available for their users. Brain and spinal interfacing devices, though still in their infancy, have come a long way in the last 20 years. At this level of the nervous system, the devices no longer monitor one sensorimotor pathway. Individual neurons and the networks made by them in the brain and spinal column must now be detected and decoded. Only recent developments in machine learning have made this extremely complex and high bandwidth processing a possibility. Taking advantage of developments in computer science and material engineering, spinal neuroprosthesis now presents the opportunity of enabling paraplegics to walk on their own 2 legs once more. while brain interfacing prostheses are developed to the degree that individual neuronal action potentials can be detected and used to control robotic limbs, to help alleviate symptoms of neurological disorders, and even to enhance neurological functioning. Though infections and tissue irritation remains a serious drawback of all long-term neurological implants, material technology and device design continues to improve, so this limitation is becoming less of a problem with each passing year. As the hardware design improves, so too does software. Continued advancements in computer science, especially artificial intelligence, will enable more intuitive and reliable control over these devices. This technology represents a path towards independence and a quality of life that would have previously been thought impossible for these patients. These devices enable people who in previous decades would have had very little independence to engage with society on their own terms again. This represents a profound shift in the outlook for those in our communities who suffer disabilities and is therefore an important area of future research and development.